The cost of barrels was a very heavy item, ranging up to $2.50 apiece. By installing his own cooperage plant and buying the forest land for the staves, the cost was cut to a little over $1.50 each. The firm dried lumber in kilns before transportation to cut weight and thus save on transportation cost. Samuel Andrews was a master of refining techniques, and he saw to it that very little oil was wasted. Even the sulfuric acid was recovered, and the yields of kerosene was high. The firm manufactured benzene, and during the Civil War, with the supply of turpentine from the south cut off, it was used in paints and varnishes. Paraffin was sold. It was used for candles and for chewing gum, so we see why the firm did so well. Vaseline, then called petrolatum, was finding a demand. Residuum for lubricating oils was sold to other refiners, until Joshua Merrill in 1868 discovered how to deodorize lubricating oil, because we heard about that earlier. It smelled so bad. The demand was restricted. Not too many people wanted it. Quote, after that it became an important product. Refiners were learning how to produce dyes from oil. Practically every component could be used, but the only use for gasoline was to heat stills. So oil, as such, could be turned into many, many commodities. But then there was this crap that always came off, gasoline, and there was only one use: just light it on fire. It's odd. We don't think of it that way, do we? So let's just note, if we don't think about gasoline that way, we think of it as the reason that we get oil out of the ground, so we can get gasoline and drive around in our cars. And that sort of is the reason, isn't it? But gasoline used to be a nuisance. Isn't that interesting how capitalism works? Oil was a nuisance, someone developed a use. Gasoline was a nuisance, someone developed a use. And in both cases, each commodity, the new use took over all previous uses and put all kinds of other uses out. Capitalism's crazy that way, you know? Now, Ida Tarbell wrote a history of Standard Oil, and it was serialized and put in Harper's Weekly, I believe. So that's who she is. Quote, though assailing Rockefeller on moral counts, Ida Tarbell had to concede that his success stemmed in part from his ability to eliminate waste and cut cost. So she was railing about how evil it was, but she did have to admit he's more efficient, he cuts cost, he doesn't waste as much. Rockefeller had a very, very cautious attitude. Quote, if too exultant when he first went into business, he would say to himself, now a little success, soon you'll be thrown down, soon you'll be overthrown, so look out, or you'll lose your head. Go steady. Now that he was launched, he would say to himself, you've got a fair fortune, you've got a good property now, but suppose the oil gives out. Suppose the oil gives out. So always have in mind the possibility of going down, and always try to go up. He was building for the future, not knowing how much oil there was underground or where. But beginning in 1864, strikes at Cherry Run and then Pit Hole convinced Rockefeller that oil was here to stay. The demand had soared during the war, despite the fact that 1/3 of the population in the South was cut off, and that the wartime tax of $1 a barrel on crude and 10 cents on a gallon on refined made the price very steep. Still, high demand. In November 1861, the first shipload of oil, 3,000 barrels, had crossed the ocean to Britain. So, finally, 1861, some oil gets shipped over to Britain. It used to be 500,000 barrels a year, remember, in 1859. So, none of it was getting shipped to Britain. But now, so the people who talk about overproduction, here's the very first bit getting shipped to Britain. Why didn't we ship 17,000 barrels to Britain? Why didn't we ship to Germany? Why didn't we ship it everywhere? No such thing as overproduction. It's just lack of ability to consume, lack of ability to distribute. Because of the well-known flammability of oil, a crew had been secured only by getting seamen drunk and shanghaiing them. Now there was no difficulty in getting crews, and the export demand was tremendous. This was important, since the population of the United States, then 31 million, was a small fraction of that of Europe. We've got lots of oil, but we don't need it all. Do you know that we exported oil, I believe, until the 40s or 50s? Now, I'll quote 1865. They talk about how it is folly now to denominate. This is from a quote from the Boston Commercial Bulletin. It is folly now to denominate petroleum as a humbug, or to view the oil industry as a bubble that will soon explode or pass into history as one of the things that were. There are flourishing towns that have been built up wholly by oil discoveries, railroads solely built to convey petroleum, and so blocked up with it that they cannot furnish enough rolling stock to accommodate the trade. There are barrels, millions of them, oozing with petroleum. There are banks, newspapers, hotels, insurance companies, all resting on the products of these wells. Through all the seasons of navigation, the Allegheny has been crowded with vessels of every description laden with petroleum. Pittsburgh, which used to be the Iron City, thinks now of little else but petroleum." End quote. The New York World said in 1866, quote, "The development of petroleum as an article of merchandise for export is one of the wonders of the 19th century." End quote. In 1866, Great Britain alone took 6,250,000 gallons. France, 4,250,000 gallons. By 1872, exports had risen to 152 million gallons, and they went to every corner of the world. A little country like Syria took 1,000,000 gallons. Egypt, 500,000. No wonder the phrase was current in the regions. Quote, "The world is weeping for oil." End quote. Now, get this. In the 1800s, America exports oil to Middle Eastern countries. Only capitalism. A British capitalist and railroad builder who visited the United States in 1865, Sir Samuel Morton Peto, wrote in The Resources and Prospects of America, that's a book, quote, "It is difficult to find a parallel to such a blessing bestowed upon a nation in the hour of her direst need." What he's referring to there is the fact we found oil when, in 1860, 1861, the oil industry develops over the course of the Civil War. We really need a source of income to help build the nation, to help bring capital in. I'm going to go now to page 46. The biggest bone of contention was Rockefeller's incessant borrowing, which terrified Maurice Clark. Rockefeller says, quote, "I had worn out the knees of my pants these days, begging for credit." He went to bed wondering how he was going to repay large sums he had borrowed, and awoke wondering where he was going to borrow more. This policy brought him into collision with Clark. One day Clark, exasperated, said to him, quote, "We have been asking for too many loans in order to extend this oil business. Why, altogether we have borrowed $100,000. Rockefeller replied, "We should borrow whenever we can safely extend the business by doing so." I mean, that's a tautological statement. And Clark answered, "If that's the way you want to do business, we'd better dissolve and let you run your own affairs to suit yourself." End quote. Though it was probably bad temper and bluff on Clark's part, Rockefeller lost not a moment in putting a notice of dissolution in the paper. He felt that the timid Clark was a drag on him. He scouted Andrews,